They called it the Panther problem. By 1944, the German Panzerkampfwagen V, the Panther, was the terror of the European battlefields. Its long-barreled 75mm gun could punch through Allied armor at ranges where American shells simply bounced off. Its sloped frontal armor turned even the best hits into ricochets. To the men of the U.S. Army, especially those driving Sherman tanks, meeting a Panther head-on was often a death sentence. The M4 Sherman had been America's workhorse, reliable, fast, easy to produce. But by the time the Allies landed in Normandy, it was no longer a match for German armor. Sherman crews joked grimly that their tanks were Ronsons, like the lighter, because they lit up every time. Facing a Panther or a Tiger meant praying that air support or artillery would intervene before it was too late. But then something changed. In late 1944, whispers began spreading through the armored divisions, rumors of a new kind of round, a strange, silvery projectile that looked different from the dull steel shells they'd been firing for years. Some called it a miracle bullet. Others thought it was just propaganda to boost morale. But the few crews who had seen it in action spoke in hushed tones of Shermans, killing Panthers from distances once thought impossible. It was called the HVAP, the high-velocity armor-piercing round, and it was about to turn the tables on the battlefield in ways the Germans never expected. To understand why it was so revolutionary, we need to step back. At the start of the war, the U.S. didn't design its tanks to go toe-to-toe with enemy armor. The doctrine was simple. Tanks were for supporting infantry, not for fighting other tanks. Anti-tank work was supposed to be done by specialized tank destroyers, lighter, faster vehicles carrying powerful guns. But on the battlefields of North Africa, Italy, and later France, that theory fell apart. Tanks inevitably fought tanks, and the Shermans, with their short-barreled 75mm guns, were outgunned and under-armored. When American crews met the German Panthers and Tigers in 1943 and 1944, the difference was staggering. The Panther's frontal armor, 80mm thick and sharply sloped, could shrug off nearly any shell the Sherman fired. Even the improved 76mm gun, introduced later in the war, struggled to penetrate that armor except at dangerously close ranges. The Germans, confident in their engineering, saw this as proof of their superiority. The Panther was their answer to the Russian T-34, but against the Allies in the West, it was a nightmare weapon. Commanders like Guderian had envisioned the Panther as a mobile, deadly tank capable of dominating long-range engagements. And that's exactly what it did, until the HVAP arrived. The HVAP round looked unassuming at first glance. Its official designation was M93 HVAPT, high-velocity armor-piercing tracer. But its secret lay in its construction. Unlike ordinary shells made from steel, the HVAP had a dense tungsten carbide core, a material harder than almost anything on Earth. Instead of relying on mass and size, it relied on sheer speed and density to punch through armor like a hot knife through butter. When fired, the lightweight outer shell, the sabot, would peel away, leaving the dense tungsten dart to continue forward at incredible velocity. The result was devastating. Against flat armor plates, the HVAP could penetrate thicknesses that had once been considered invulnerable to the 76mm gun. At first, only a handful of these rounds were available. They were rare, expensive, and reserved for elite crews or special missions. Tungsten was in short supply. Every ounce of it was needed for tools, cutting machinery, and other wartime industries. But in the right hands, even a few HVAP rounds could change the outcome of a tank duel. Imagine the scene: a Sherman crew, pinned down by a Panther's fire across a muddy French field. The first shots from the 76mm gun clang harmlessly off the German armor. The Panther turns its turret, ready to deliver the killing blow. But this time, the Sherman loader shoves a new, gleaming HVAP round into the breach. The gunner adjusts his aim, steadies his breath, and squeezes the trigger. The shell screams across the field at over 3,400 feet per second, faster than any Sherman shell before it. It hits the Panther's front plate, and instead of bouncing off, it punches straight through. The tungsten core tears into the crew compartment, igniting fuel, ammunition, and panic. For the first time, The hunter becomes the hunted. Word spread quickly. Panther crews, who once rolled confidently into combat, now found themselves checking their angles, fearing the once-mocked Sherman. Reports from the front puzzled German commanders. Shermans destroying Panthers at 800, even 1,000 meters. It didn't make sense, not according to the physics they knew. And yet, it was happening. But behind every success story lay a struggle, not just on the battlefield, but in the factories and supply chains that made HVAP possible. America's vast industry could build thousands of tanks, but tungsten was another story. Each HVAP round required precious tungsten carbide, much of which came from limited sources in China and South America. The U.S. had to decide where to send it, to cutting tools for factories, to armor-piercing shells for aircraft, or to the tank crews facing the Panthers. For the men on the front, those decisions meant life or death. They knew that without HVAP, their 76mm guns were nearly useless against the German heavy tanks. With it, they had a fighting chance. The race was on, not just between nations, but between technology, industry, and survival itself. And as 1944 turned into 1945, the battlefield balance began to shift in ways no one, especially the Germans, could have imagined. By the winter of 1944, the tide of war in Europe was turning, but for many Allied tankers, victory still felt distant. The Ardennes had erupted into chaos during the Battle of the Bulge. German Panthers and Tigers prowled the forests, ambushing columns of Shermans that struggled to respond. The Americans were fighting not only the enemy in front of them, but the fear that their own weapons simply weren't enough. In that desperate cold, HVAP rounds began arriving at the front in small, precious shipments. Wooden crates marked special ammunition were unloaded under guard. Crews huddled around them like men opening treasure chests. Inside lay the silver-tipped rounds that might finally even the odds. But there weren't enough to go around. Each Sherman might receive only 3 or 4 HVAP shells at a time. Tank commanders had to make impossible decisions. When to use them. Which enemy tank was worth one of their rare HVAP rounds? A Panther at 900 yards? A Tiger cresting a ridge? Or save it for a moment when nothing else would do? Veterans later recalled how the atmosphere in their tanks changed the first time they fired one. The recoil felt sharper, the sound louder, the velocity almost frightening. The tracer streak burned a line through the air, and when it hit, the result was unmistakable, a shattering flash, a plume of smoke, and the disbelief of men who had just witnessed a Sherman outgun a Panther. One after-action report from the 3rd Armored Division described a 76mm Sherman knocking out a Panther from over 1,200 yards using HVAP ammunition. Before that, such a thing would have been dismissed as impossible. The Germans, who had long relied on their superior optics and long-range guns, suddenly found themselves vulnerable in engagements they once controlled with ease. But what made the HVAP truly fascinating wasn't just its power. It was the science behind it. The idea of firing a lighter outer shell that discards in flight, leaving a dense penetrator, was decades ahead of its time. The HVAP was an early ancestor of what modern militaries now call APDS, armor-piercing discarding sabot, and it represented a leap in how engineers thought about penetrating armor. The secret lay in the physics of kinetic energy. Armor penetration isn't only about size. It's about how much energy is concentrated at a single point. A dense, fast-moving core could deliver far more force on impact than a slower, heavier shell. The tungsten core of the HVAP, traveling at blistering speeds, transferred so much energy into the target that armor plates shattered instead of bending. For the Germans, who prided themselves on building the most advanced tanks in the world, this was a rude awakening. Their engineers had calculated the protection of their tanks against known Allied rounds, steel projectiles traveling at predictable speeds. They hadn't counted on tungsten. The Panther's 80mm sloped glassy plate, once untouchable, could now be pierced at angles that defied expectations. There are accounts of German crews being stunned to find clean, narrow holes punched straight through their armor, as if by an invisible spear. To them, it must have felt like dark magic. How could a Sherman, the tank they'd mocked as inferior, suddenly destroy them frontally? But technology, as always, came with limits. The VAP's effectiveness depended heavily on range. At short and medium distances, it was devastating, but over longer ranges, its light sabot design lost velocity faster than conventional rounds. Against side armor or weak points, it was lethal, but against the heaviest frontal plates of the Tiger II, even HVAP struggled. Still, it gave Allied crews, something they hadn't felt in a long time, confidence. The Germans tried to adapt. They added more armor, improved camouflage, and relied increasingly on defensive ambushes rather than open duels. Yet every adaptation drained resources they no longer had. The Allies, meanwhile, pushed their advantage, and the HVAP became a symbol of American innovation, catching up to German engineering. And the story doesn't end with tanks. The same principle of tungsten core ammunition began appearing in aircraft armament, too. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings used similar types of armor-piercing rounds to attack German tanks from above. What had started as a secret tank ammunition project was becoming part of a broader shift in wartime technology. Speed, precision, and scientific ingenuity replacing brute force. Interestingly, even though the Germans were initially shocked by the HVAP, they weren't entirely unfamiliar with the concept. Their own Panzergranate 40, a tungsten core round, had been used earlier in the war, particularly by the 50mm and 75mm guns. But by 1943, Germany's tungsten supplies had run dangerously low, and production of such ammunition had almost stopped. The Allies, with their global access to materials, could afford to do what Germany could not: mass-produce high-velocity, tungsten-cored rounds when it mattered most. Still, there was a strange irony. While the U.S. had the resources, even they struggled to make enough HVAP ammunition. Tungsten was precious, needed for machine tools and industrial equipment that kept the war machine running. American commanders often debated whether to prioritize tools for factories or shells for tanks. Some units even traded supplies informally just to get a few extra rounds. The scarcity only added to the mystique. Tankers treated HVAP rounds like gold. Some even carved small notches on their turrets for every Panther they destroyed with one. In the chaos of war, these shining tungsten darts had become a symbol of hope. Reports from Germany's intelligence units eventually reached Berlin, describing new, high-speed projectiles used by American tanks. But by then, it was too late. The Reich was crumbling, and the once feared Panthers were being hunted by the very tanks they had dominated only months earlier. The psychological shift was enormous. German crews who once viewed Shermans as easy prey began to second-guess every engagement. The moment they saw a 76mm gun barrel, they couldn't be sure what kind of round might be waiting in the chamber. And in war, uncertainty can be as deadly as any weapon. The HVAP had changed the game, not by overwhelming numbers, but through fear, surprise, and precision. And as Allied forces closed in on the heart of Germany, this new weapon would help tip the scales in countless tank battles that decided the fate of towns, bridges, and roads. But the story wasn't over yet, because in the final months of the war, as the Allies pushed through the Siegfried Line and into the Ruhr, the HVAP would prove not just to be a tactical advantage, but a symbol of how innovation and desperation collide when the world is at war. By early 1945, the fields of Western Europe were scarred with wrecks, blackened hulks of Panthers and Shermans scattered across the frozen landscape. The last battles of the war were brutal, desperate, and fast-moving. German tank units, once the terror of the Eastern and Western fronts, were now fighting with fewer tanks, less fuel, and dwindling morale. Yet even in retreat, the Panthers remained deadly. Their long 75mm guns still cut through Allied armor with ease, unless, of course, they faced a Sherman armed with HVAP rounds. The difference was immediate, almost cinematic. In places like the Ruhr Valley and the outskirts of Cologne, tank duels erupted in ruined streets and snow-covered villages. A Sherman with a 76mm gun and even a handful of HVAP shells could now go toe-to-toe with the dreaded Panthers that guarded crossroads and bridges. One eyewitness account from the 2nd Armored Division described a tense standoff outside a small German town. The Panther fired first, its shell slamming into the Sherman's glassy plate and punching through the transmission housing. But miraculously, it didn't ignite. The American crew scrambled, heartbeats pounding, the gunners shouting coordinates. The loader grabbed one of the precious HVAP rounds and slammed it into the breech. The Sherman fired back. The tungsten dart crossed the open street in a split second, striking the Panther squarely beneath the gun mantlet. The German tank erupted into fire. For the men inside the Sherman, that single moment erased months of fear. Stories like these spread quickly, not through official reports, but through campfire whispers, mess tents, and letters home. The HVAP had become legendary, proof that the underdog could fight back. But the Germans were not ignorant of what was happening. Captured American ammunition and damaged Panthers revealed the truth. German scientists studied the holes and found the unmistakable signature of tungsten core penetrators. They recognized the danger immediately, but it was too late to respond. Their own tungsten reserves were nearly gone, and Allied bombers had shattered the factories that could have produced countermeasures. The irony was cruel. Germany had pioneered many of the concepts behind high-velocity ammunition early in the war, but now the Allies had the materials and industrial might to perfect them. What began as a technical curiosity had turned into a decisive battlefield equalizer. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, tank battles grew shorter and more one-sided. The once dominant Panthers, operating on fumes and without air cover, often found themselves ambushed or flanked by waves of Shermans. Where once the American tankers might have hesitated, now they attacked boldly, knowing that even a few HVAP rounds could give them the edge. In the final months of fighting, as Allied forces approached the Rhine, HVAP ammunition was finally being distributed more widely. Factories back in the States had managed to increase production just enough to send extra shipments overseas. For many crews, it was almost poetic justice. They'd survived years of feeling outgunned, and now, at the end, they finally had the firepower to strike back with confidence. In one of the most striking encounters of the campaign, near Remagen in March 1945, a unit of Shermans reportedly destroyed a column of Panthers guarding a retreating convoy. Using HVAP at medium range, the Shermans picked off the lead and rear tanks, trapping the rest in place. Within minutes, the once formidable German armor column was in flames. For the American crews, it was vindication, the proof that ingenuity and persistence could overcome even the most feared war machines. Still, the HVAP story wasn't only about victory. It was also a lesson in limits, in how even the most advanced technology can be held back by logistics, materials, and timing. Throughout 1944 and 1945, many Sherman crews never saw a single HVAP round. For every tank that carried a few, dozens went into battle with nothing but standard armor-piercing shells. In that sense, the VAP's legacy was as much psychological as physical. It gave soldiers hope, courage, and belief that they could stand their ground. After the war, as engineers studied what had worked and what hadn't, they realized the HVAP had marked the beginning of a new era in tank warfare. The idea of using lightweight sabots and dense penetrators would evolve into post-war designs, the British APDS, the American APFSDS, and eventually the hypervelocity tank rounds that dominate modern armored combat. The seeds of 21st century tank guns were planted in those late-war HVAP experiments. German tank veterans later admitted their surprise. Many had assumed the Sherman would never be a match for them. In interviews decades later, some described the shock of being hit by what felt like an invisible hammer, clean holes appearing where no shell should have penetrated. To them, it was as if the Allies had suddenly leaped ahead in technology overnight. For the Americans, it was a story of redemption. The humble Sherman, often mocked for its thin armor and weak gun, had fought its way to respectability through sheer innovation. The HVAP didn't make it invincible, but it made it dangerous. And that was enough to turn the fearsome German Panther from an unstoppable predator into a vulnerable target. When the war finally ended, the lessons of the HVAP carried on. Military strategists saw what had happened, how a single technological breakthrough, applied with the right timing, could rewrite the rules of battle. In the years that followed, every major army invested in high-velocity kinetic ammunition. The world had entered a new age, one where speed, density, and science mattered as much as armor thickness or gun size. But for the men who were there, the tankers who loaded those gleaming silver shells in the mud and smoke of Europe. It wasn't about theories or engineering. It was about survival, about turning fear into firepower, about finally having a weapon that could make the enemy flinch first. Many of those veterans later said that when they saw the tungsten cores glinting in the light, they felt something change inside them, a quiet confidence, a sense that the balance had shifted. The Germans might still have had the best tanks, but the Americans had found a way to fight smarter. And in war, sometimes that's all it takes. In the end, the HVAP didn't just pierce armor. It pierced the myth of invincibility that surrounded the German Panthers. It reminded the world that no machine, no matter how advanced, is beyond defeat when innovation meets determination. The Germans never expected the 76mm Sherman to become a Panther-killer. But history remembers that, for a brief and decisive moment, it did. And that moment, when a simple tungsten dart turned the tide of fear, became one of the most remarkable stories of armored warfare in World War II.